Last week, we talked about some mysteries that remained open throughout 2025, cold cases, unanswered stories, music, and even enigmas of space that, for now, remain without a definitive explanation. But not all mysteries are destined to remain that way forever. Every year, new technologies, scientific breakthroughs, and forgotten files that are reopened manage to move pieces that had been stuck in the same spot for decades. Today we are going to talk about exactly that: unsettling, strange, and at times deeply tragic cases that finally found a resolution in the year that just ended. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 mysteries that were solved in 2025. We hope to see you over there as well. How are you? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Let's begin. The ghost shipwreck of the F.J. King. We start with one of the oldest mysteries on our list, one that takes us to Lake Michigan in the United States, a site that at first glance is a huge expanse of serene water, almost motionless on certain days, but beneath its surface lies something very different. A true invisible cemetery full of ships that never made it home. During the 19th century, these waters were one of the most important trade routes in the country. Thousands of vessels crossed the Great Lakes, transporting grain, lumber, iron, and all kinds of goods. And with them, traveled men who trusted that the weather, the timber, and their experience would be enough to return alive. But many of them were wrong, and as time passed, dozens of ships were caught in sudden storms, sinking without a trace and forming a hidden landscape that we are only just beginning to understand. Among all those shipwrecks, one began to stand out over the years, not for the magnitude of its tragedy, but for how impossible it seemed to find. A ship that, despite multiple attempts, simply would not appear, as if it had vanished into the lake. We are talking about the ship F.J. King. It was a 3-masted wooden brigantine, built in 1,867 inches Toledo, Ohio. For almost 20 years, it navigated the Great Lakes normally, dedicated to cargo transport between different ports. There was nothing particularly strange in its history, nor previous accidents that would make one think its name would end up becoming a legend. But that changed the night of the 15th of September 1886, when in the middle of the night, the F.J. King, moving from Escanaba, Michigan, toward Chicago, and loaded with iron off the Door Peninsula, encountered an increasingly violent storm, with waves several meters high striking the hull without pause. The wood began to give way, and little by little, the ship's seams opened, allowing water to start entering. The crew spent hours trying to contain the flooding, pumping nonstop, until it became evident that the ship would not hold much longer. And so, in the midst of the darkness, Captain William Griffin ordered the ship abandoned. The men climbed into the small auxiliary boat and began to row toward the coast, watching as the ship was left behind at the mercy of the storm. From the water, they witnessed its final moments. The F.J. King began to sink bow first as the wind and waves shook it violently. In that final instant, the rear deck structure was blown off, launching the captain's papers several meters into the air before it disappeared along with the rest of the ship into the lake. Minutes later, nothing remained visible, only darkness and agitated water. The crew managed to survive, as another vessel rescued them and took them to Bailey's Harbor, where the shipwreck was officially reported. However, from that moment on, contradictions began. The captain indicated that the ship had sunk several kilometers from the coast in deep water, but a few days later, the local lighthouse keeper claimed to have seen the masts of a vessel protruding from the water much closer to the shore. Music. Over the years, fishermen claimed their nets had brought up fragments of wood they could not identify. And despite everything, no one managed to find the wreck. Starting in the 1970s, divers, historians, and shipwreck hunters began to search for it systematically. A reward was even offered to anyone who could locate it, but expedition after expedition returned empty-handed. The F.J. King was not where official records said it was, nor where the testimonies pointed, and little by little, it began to earn an unsettling nickname among the local community: the ghost ship of Lake Michigan. More than 100 years passed until, in June 2025, a group of historians and scientists decided to try one more time. They did not set out with the certainty that they would find it, but with the idea of reviewing a zone that in theory had already been explored countless times using modern technology. Based on historical documents and the old testimony of the lighthouse keeper, they delimited a specific area and began to scan the bottom of the lake with sonar. Barely 2 hours after starting the search, on the team's second pass, a silhouette appeared on the screen. It was elongated, too defined to be a natural formation. When they measured the object, the dimensions matched those of the FJ King exactly. The ghost ship was less than half a kilometer from the point indicated in 1886 by the lighthouse keeper. Using remotely operated vehicles, the researchers descended to the bottom of the lake and observed the hull for the first time in 139 years. Against all odds, the FJ King was notably intact, and so, after so much time, a mystery that seemed impossible to solve reached its end. Furthermore, it became clear that this search had been prolonged, not because the ship had moved, nor because the lake had hidden it in an inexplicable way, but because for decades it had been searched for in the wrong place. Today, the FJ King is no longer just a legend, but a piece of history that has been recovered: the murder of Louisa Don. On the 28th of June 1967, Louisa Don, a 75-year-old woman, was found dead in her home on Britannia Road in the Easton neighborhood of Bristol, England. She lived alone, was well known by her neighbors, and used to spend her mornings chatting at her front door. When her newspaper remained untouched on the garden wall that day, someone knew something was not right. Louisa had been strangled and assaulted. The scene was brutal, but the context was even more so, as her own home, the one place where she should have felt safe, had become the setting of a crime. Her own crime. The news shook the community and sparked one of the biggest investigations Bristol had ever seen. Music. The police acted with the resources available in 1967, and palm prints were taken from almost 19,000 men. Thousands of interviews were conducted, backgrounds were checked, and streets were searched house by house. Everything pointed to the killer being someone nearby, someone who could not have gone very far. But even so, he went unnoticed. The perpetrator lived just outside the perimeter the police had defined as the key zone. At that time, he had no prior record. There was nothing to betray him, and as the months passed, this case went cold, becoming just another file in an archive that no one wanted to open again. Over the following years, time kept moving forward. Many witnesses died, others forgot details, and the city learned to live with the absence of answers. Louisa became just another name on a huge list of unsolved crimes in the United Kingdom. However, the story did not end there. Decades later, in the 70s, a man was arrested in Ipswich for sexual abuse against two elderly women. His modus operandi was unsettlingly similar, as he would break into houses at night, attack elderly women living alone, and disappear without a trace. The man was convicted, but the connection to the Bristol case was never made. This was because there were no national databases, nor systems that allowed connecting dots separated by hundreds of kilometers and several years. This man was Ryan Headley. For more than half a century, the murder of Louisa Don remained trapped in that limbo that defines cold cases. Until in 2023, a small police team decided to review the file again, and this time they found something. The key was in an item of clothing carefully preserved since 1967, a blue skirt that had been with Louisa in her final moments. During the review, a forensic specialist determined the exact point where, due to the position of the body, it was most probable that biological material would have remained. Thus, by cutting a small section of the garment, they managed to extract a complete genetic profile from semen, which had remained detectable for almost 57 years. The result was conclusive. The DNA was billions of times more likely to belong to Ryan Headley than to any other person in the world. And not only that, but there was also a partial palm print found on a window, which also matched his. Everything that in 1967 had been insufficient became irrefutable in 2025. The trial began in June of this past year. Many of the witnesses were no longer alive, so their original statements had to be read in court as records of the past. This made for an almost surreal scene, as those words written decades ago returned to life to point at a 92-year-old man who, for most of his life, believed he had gotten away with it forever. And so, on the 30th of June 2025, Ryan Headley was found guilty of the murder of Louisa Don. The next day, the judge made it clear that the sentence meant one thing: this man would die in prison. Justice, firm if late, finally caught up to someone who had spent almost his entire life looking forward, convinced that the past would not reach him. For Louisa's family, especially her granddaughter, there was not really a happy ending. There is no real closure after a crime like this. But there is something that for 58 years was denied to them. Knowing who was responsible and seeing that, although late, this person faced the consequences. The case of Louisa Don remained unsolved for almost 6 decades, until in 2025 a response finally arrived. The Woman of Roses of Vladikans. Including this case may generate some debate among the audience, since although a significant part of the mystery was solved, the other half remains an open question. Still, we decided to include it and tell everything known about a story that for many years was known not by a name, but by a description. A body found next to a highway, a suspicious scene, and an identity that never arrived. For 2 decades in Spain, this file was remembered simply as that of the Woman of Roses. Music. On the 3rd of July 2005, a taxi driver found the lifeless body of a woman in an area near a highway in the municipality of Viladecans, in the province of Barcelona. The place did not seem like a habitual transit point, nor a place where someone would have stopped by accident. The body was there because someone had put it there. The woman carried no identification, no purse, nor any object that would allow them to know who she was. She was wearing a very striking outfit, a pink blouse with flowers, pink pants, and sandals of the same color. That detail, which in another context would have been irrelevant, ended up becoming the only way to refer to her. Thus, the name with which the case would be known for years was born. From the very beginning, investigators considered the death suspicious. The evidence indicated that the body had been moved to the site of the discovery several hours after the time of death, approximately 12. It was not an accidental death or a sudden collapse on a public road. Something had occurred beforehand in another place. Despite initial investigations, it was impossible to establish her identity. There were no matches in national databases, no relatives appeared, and no one reported her missing in Spain. Neither were there clear links to her immediate environment. It was as if the woman did not exist within any accessible record at that time. Thus, the case remained open, but without progress. For years, the Woman of Roses remained a provisional name within police archives. Attempts were made to identify her through local records, missing persons databases, and international inquiries, but all of this did not obtain results either. The file was never officially closed, although as time passed, it was relegated, trapped in that intermediate point where there are no new leads, but no definitive answers either. Music. However, this situation changed almost 20 years later. In 2023, the case was incorporated into an international initiative coordinated by Interpol, known as Identify Me. The objective of this campaign was to identify women found dead in different European countries whose identity remained unknown, many of them in contexts of violence or in unexplained circumstances. For the first time, Interpol decided to make public the so-called black notices, sharing biometric information, facial reconstructions, fingerprints, and details of the cases, both with police forces and with the public. As part of this program, fingerprints and genetic profiles were shared with police forces of almost 200 countries. They were not looking to solve homicides immediately, but something prior and fundamental, knowing at least who these women were. In that context, it was in 2025 that the decisive breakthrough occurred. The fingerprints associated with the Woman of Roses case were cross-referenced by the Turkish police with a national database. The match appeared there. The prints corresponded to a Russian citizen named Ludmila Zavada, who had passed through Turkish territory years earlier. Zavada was 31 years old at the time of her death. After this finding, the identity was verified by Spanish authorities through the forensic anthropology section and confirmed subsequently through a genetic kinship analysis. The victim's DNA was compared with that of a close relative, which allowed for closing any doubt. The confirmation arrived officially in September 2025. After almost 20 years, the Woman of Roses finally obtained a name. However, as we mentioned before, this breakthrough did not mean the closing of the case. Spanish authorities made it clear that identifying the victim does not equate to solving her death. To this day, there are no suspects in custody nor a conclusive hypothesis about what happened to her. It is not known where she died, who was with her last, nor why her body ended up abandoned on the side of a road. Today, we know that it was Ludmila Zavada, and her identity stopped being just a nickname to take a real place within these records. But the file, unfortunately, still remains incomplete. Hello. If you are enjoying this content, we remind you that we have other content that you might surely be interested in. We have, for example, Noctambulos Podcast, where we talk about true crime and other strange occurrences in a chat like friends. We also have a new episode of Mundo Creepy Stories every Friday, with the most terrifying tales from our audience. And of course, Mundo Creepy Creepypastas, where we tell stories that we write ourselves. Everything is available on YouTube and also on audio platforms. Thank you very much. And we continue with this episode, the Tumat wolf pups. After what we have seen so far, this case located almost in the middle of the list acts as a necessary breather within this journey. But that is not to say it is less interesting. In fact, it helps to reconstruct an important part of human history. In 2011 and 2015, in a remote region of northern Siberia, near the Tumat River, the frozen bodies of two small puppies were found. They were buried in the permafrost, perfectly preserved with their fur, teeth, and even internal organs in a surprising state. From the first moment, the discovery caught the attention of the scientific community and the general public due to one very simple reason. These animals seemed too close to dogs. For years, the great unknown was whether they were wild wolves or some of the first dogs domesticated by prehistoric humans, a difference that was not small, because if the puppies had been dogs, this would have meant that canine domestication occurred in history much earlier than believed, and in a region very different from the one normally accepted as the origin of that relationship between humans and canines. Initial dating indicated that the bodies were about 14,000 years old, a time when humans were still hunters and gatherers and where the line between wolf and dog was still diffuse. For more than 10 years, the case remained trapped in this same ambiguity. There were studies that suggested behaviors compatible with human proximity, but others pointed out that there was no clear evidence of domestication. Soon, the Tumat puppies became an important scientific mystery. For those who do not know, the domestication of the dog is one of the most important events in human history, as it was the first alliance between our species and a wild animal, a relationship that changed hunting, the protection of groups, and eventually daily life. So, knowing when and how it happened is one of the big questions of archaeology and evolutionary biology. For years, these remains remained stored, waiting for technology to provide a clearer answer, an answer that arrived in 2025. That year, an international team of scientists published an exhaustive genetic study based on ancient DNA extracted directly from the puppies. The analysis was much more advanced than any previous attempt and allowed comparing their genome with that of ancient wolves, primitive dogs, and modern dogs. Thus, finally, a definitive conclusion was reached. The Tumat puppies were not dogs, nor were they an intermediate link in the process of domestication. They were wild wolves. This study confirmed that although they shared certain traits with the ancestors of modern dogs, they showed no genetic signs of having been domesticated, nor of having lived closely with humans. Additionally, the analysis of the stomach content of one of the puppies revealed remains of a woolly rhinoceros, indicating that their pack hunted large prey, a behavior typical of fully wild wolves. And with this, the mystery was finally solved. For more than a decade, these small frozen bodies had fueled theories, speculations, and debates about the origin of the modern dog. In 2025, science was finally able to close the case with clarity. They were not animals raised by humans. They were not part of an early experiment in domestication, but simply members of a wolf pack that lived and died in a brutal, frozen, and prehistoric world. The case of Janet Ralston. Now we will delve into a case that occurred in an era when solving a crime depended almost entirely on testimonies, police intuition, and a few physical tests that often could not say much on their own. On the night of the 31st of January 1977, Janet Ralston, 24, was at the Lion's Den bar in San Jose, California. It was a habitual place, a site she frequented with friends. Shortly before midnight, several people saw her leave the bar accompanied by a man no one recognized. Janet commented that she would return in about 10 minutes, but she never came back. The next morning, the owner of an apartment complex located a few minutes from the bar noticed a Volkswagen Beetle parked in the garage area, and upon approaching, he saw something out of place. Inside the vehicle, in the back seat, was Janet's body. She had been placed by force with her torso jammed and her legs bent. In addition, she was wearing a long-sleeved blouse tied tightly around her neck. The autopsy confirmed that she had died by strangulation and that she had also been sexually assaulted. After checking the car, The authorities noticed that it showed clear signs of a failed arson attempt. That is, someone had tried to burn it, but the fire did not spread. All this indicated that the perpetrator had acted in a hurry and had made several mistakes. After this, the police began to reconstruct Janet's last hours. They interviewed her friends, the bar employees, and some neighbors in the area. A composite sketch of the man she was last seen with was also made, but it was precisely inside the car that a key clue appeared. In this case, a fingerprint marked on an EV cigarette pack, a brand Janet used to smoke. That print was correctly lifted, documented, and archived. The problem was that in 1977, a fingerprint without a direct match was little more than an incomplete record, as there were no interconnected national databases nor systems capable of crossing millions of profiles in a matter of seconds. The evidence was there, but it led nowhere. So, little by little, the case stalled, and over the years, the investigation became frozen. What was not known then was that at the time of the murder, the man who had left that print was a private in the U.S. Army stationed at Fort Ord, a little over an hour from San Jose, and his name was Willie Eugene Sims. A year after the crime, Sims was convicted in Monterey County for assault with intent to commit murder. This in a different case. Sims served a prison sentence, and upon regaining his freedom, he left California and moved to Ohio before DNA began to be collected systematically, and before a national database existed. This is why, by the time technology advanced, he was already out of the system. For decades, that print recovered from the cigarette pack remained stored, apparently without utility, at least until the year 2024, when investigators from the Cold Case Unit of Santa Clara County made a rare decision to rerun all prints from the file through the FBI system, taking advantage of a recent algorithm update for searching that allowed for more precise and broad matches than in previous years. It was not a routine review, but one last attempt. And this time, the system yielded a result. The print matched that of Willie Eugene Sims. With that identification, the investigators traveled to obtain a DNA sample, and soon the analysis confirmed what the print had suggested. The genetic profile matched material found under Janet's fingernails and with biological remains present on the garment used to strangle her. Evidence that for years had been considered insufficient now fit perfectly. And so, finally, in May 2025, almost 48 years after the murder, Sims was arrested and formally charged with the homicide of Janet Ralston. He was extradited to California and faces a potential sentence of 25 years to life imprisonment. The resolution of this case did not come from a confession, nor from a new clue, but from a print that had been waiting for almost half a century for technology to be able to interpret it correctly. And although for Janet's family this may represent a form of relief, the harsh reality is that her son, who was 6 years old when his mother died, spent almost his entire life without knowing who was responsible. Justice arrived, although it did so late. It did not change what happened in 1977. It did not erase the absence of a daughter and a mother, nor did it return anything of what was lost. It only arrived to put a name to the culprit almost 50 years later. The FBI fugitive, Arnoldo Jimenez. Of the entire list, we now enter the most recent case and, therefore, the one that took the least time to be solved. Here, the question was not what happened, who was the culprit, nor what the motivations had been. All of this was already clear from the start. The only real unknown was the whereabouts of a person, and that doubt was finally resolved. We are talking about the case of Arnoldo Jimenez. The story began in May 2012 in Illinois. On the 11th of that month, Arnoldo Jimenez and Estrella Carrera, 26, were married in a civil ceremony in Chicago. After the wedding, they celebrated with family and friends, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, in the early hours of May 12, when the couple returned home, tragedy occurred. According to the investigation, during the ride, a heated argument took place, and once in the couple's apartment located in Burbank, Illinois, Jimenez attacked Estrella Carrera and stabbed her multiple times, then placed her body in the bathtub and fled the scene. The body was found 2 days later, and one detail made the case particularly disturbing from the start. Estrella was still wearing the dress with which she had celebrated the wedding. That same month, authorities issued an arrest warrant for first-degree murder, and thanks to phone records, Jimenez's flight could be partially reconstructed. He first left Chicago, passed through Tennessee and Arkansas, arrived in Texas, and finally crossed the border into Mexico. In a matter of days, he had disappeared completely. For years, this trail went cold, and in 2019, faced with the lack of new progress, the FBI made a rare decision to include Arnaldo Jimenez on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives. A reward was offered that, over time, increased to $250,000. Authorities believed he was hiding in Mexico, possibly in states like Durango or Tamaulipas, but there was no conclusive evidence. The case became a long-term hunt. Jimenez was not only wanted for the brutal murder of his wife, but because he had managed to evade authorities for more than 10 years, moving outside the reach of American systems and taking advantage of the limitations of international cooperation of those years. But all this changed at the beginning of 2025. On January 30, Arnaldo Jimenez was located and arrested in Monterrey, Nuevo León, a capture that was carried out without violence as a result of a joint operation between the FBI, the Attorney General's Office, and Interpol. And so, after being a fugitive for almost 13 years, his whereabouts stopped being a mystery. This news was confirmed officially on the 31st of January 2025. Jimenez was held in custody in Mexico, pending the extradition process to the United States, to face charges for first-degree homicide and evasion of justice. If found guilty, he could face a sentence of 25 years to life imprisonment. For Estrella Carrera's family, the arrest does not mean complete relief, but it does mean a long-awaited closure, because for all those years they lived with the certainty of knowing who was responsible, but without the possibility of seeing him answer before the law. This capture, although it did not erase the crime, confirmed that this flight had not been eternal. The case stood out for something rare within these types of stories. There were no doubts about the culprit. There were no alternative theories, and no hypotheses remained open for years. Everything was clear from day 2. The only thing missing was finding the person responsible, and although it took so many years, justice finally ended up catching up to him, the real enemy of Napoleon Bonaparte's army. We close this list not with the bloodiest story, or the case with the most unexpected turns, but with the mystery that holds the most historical weight. And it is that when talking about Napoleon Bonaparte's disastrous campaign in 1812, the image was clear and forceful. French soldiers advancing toward Russia, trapped by a brutal winter, dying frozen, hungry, defeated by the weather. The Russian cold became the perfect villain, the definitive explanation for one of the greatest military catastrophes in history. But as happens with many accounts that we repeat for generations, the truth was much more complex, and in 2025, thanks to science, that version began to falter. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the invasion of Russia with the Grande Armée, a colossal army of more than 500,000 men. For decades, historians pointed to 3 main factors: the extreme cold, hunger, and a typhus epidemic transmitted by lice. That explanation seemed sufficient. However, there was something that did not quite fit. Records from the time spoke of diverse symptoms, of fulminant diseases, of soldiers falling even before the winter reached its cruelest point. That gave weight to the doubt of whether it had really been only the cold responsible for all of this. In Vilnius, current Vilnius in Lithuania, a mass grave with thousands of human remains was discovered at the beginning of the 21st century. Some buttons, buckles, and fragments of uniforms confirmed something archaeologists suspected: that they were soldiers of the Grande Armée, who had died during the retreat from Russia, and for years, those remains remained as witnesses to that great tragedy, although they offered no new answers, at least not until technology reached a key point, because in 2025, an international team of researchers decided to analyze the teeth of some of those soldiers. It might seem like a minor detail, but teeth, in particular the dental pulp, act as time capsules, so fragments of DNA can be preserved inside them, even centuries after death. Thanks to modern high-throughput genetic sequencing techniques, scientists managed to extract and analyze millions of fragments of degraded DNA. What they were looking for was to confirm the presence of typhus, the disease that for years was considered the main cause of death in the catastrophe. But what they found was something completely different. Instead of typhus, the analyses revealed the presence of 2 bacteria that had not been detected before in this historical context. The first was Salmonella enterica, responsible for paratyphoid fever, a serious disease that spreads through contaminated water and food. The second was Borrelia recurrentis, a bacterium transmitted by lice that causes what is called relapsing fever, a debilitating disease characterized by repeated episodes of extreme fever. Both infections were potentially deadly, and both had been devastating in an army already weakened by malnutrition, extreme fatigue, and precarious sanitary conditions. This finding changed the focus completely. It was no longer a single epidemic, nor a single factor. The irony is brutal, as while history pointed to the Russian winter as a great executioner, the true enemy traveled inside the bodies of the soldiers themselves. The researchers were careful in their conclusions. The study was based on the analysis of only 13 individuals, a small sample compared to the thousands buried in the mass grave. But that does not mean that these two bacteria were the only ones responsible, nor that they replaced typhus entirely in the historical narrative. What it does show is that the picture was much more complex than previously thought. Napoleon survived the Russian campaign, but his army was irreversibly destroyed, and that defeat marked the beginning of the end of his rule in Europe. Now we know that beyond enemy armies and extreme temperatures, there were microscopic killers involved in all of this. And today, more than 200 years later, it was necessary to open the teeth of the dead soldiers to understand that the greatest enemy of Napoleon's army was not the Russian winter, but two diseases that no one could see. We hope you found these 7 solved mysteries interesting. Thank you for subscribing and leaving your like and a comment. It helps us a lot to keep growing on this channel. We also really like doing this theme of mysteries unsolved from the previous year and mysteries that were solved in the previous year. So, if you like it too, share this video a lot. And if it does very well, we will surely do the mysteries of 2026 next year. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where you find me. And thanks to all the people who started following us from the last video. Thanks. And too bad for those who stopped following us. Without anything else to say, I say goodbye. See you later.